In this tutorial, I'm going to show you the very basics of using TinkerCAD to create 3D artwork suitable for 3D printing. And I'm assuming that you are probably willing to do a certain amount of experimentation and discover a lot of what's intuitive about TinkerCAD. So I'm really going to just get you started with that, and I'm going to finish with what I think is the most important concept, which is the sort of negative shape or void shape. Okay, so I started a design in TinkerCAD. I usually try to organize my designs in TinkerCAD by renaming them to something useful, so it's easy for me to quickly identify what it is I'm working with later on. So you probably can guess on the right-hand side here is a shape menu, right? So if I click and drag a shape from that menu onto the work plane, so labeled, I can then work with this shape. I can modify it, I can change the size, and so on. So if I click these white squares, I am dragging at the corners. If I hold down the Shift key, TinkerCAD is going to maintain the proportions of the particular shape. If I click and drag the little black squares on the sides, it's going to reshape as if that's a drag handle. And again, if I hold down the Shift key, it's going to maintain proportions instead. I'll keep that proportional. If I click anywhere that's not on one of those little cues, I've highlighted the object. Now I can click and drag it around the workspace. However, there is the z-axis, or the height, and that's usually denoted by a little cone either above or below the object, depending on how the camera is oriented. In this case, I'm above the object, so if I click and I drag that cone, it's just going to move it up and down. And you can see it can go below the workspace plane, and there are times on designs where that's useful. That really covers the gamut. You can experiment with variations on that. There's more features. Obviously, if you click on a particular handle, you're going to see that these numbers come up, and you can adjust numbers by typing them in to resize a particular object. There are these little arrows, I should say this, that are on arcs. So you click and you drag them, and it reorients the object by rotating it along one axis or another. And obviously you can rotate that along different axes. Okay, so there's the object itself you're working with, and basically most designs are some combination of different objects. And in the finished product, you're going to have a combination of different objects representing different shapes. I'll say more about that in a minute. However, you probably need to move your view around, your sort of camera view of how you're viewing the object. And there's a number of ways to do that. I can hold down the right mouse button and move around the space. If I hold down, I have a scroll wheel on my mouse. It also doubles as a button, so it's a center button. That is as if I'm grabbing the workspace and moving myself, and so I can move myself around. I can zoom in using the scroll wheel itself instead of just clicking on it. And I can also, and I use this a lot, if I highlight an object, I can then come over to this icon here with sort of four corners on the left-hand side. If I hover over it, it says Fit View to Selected Shapes. You will also notice there is a keyboard shortcut, the letter F. If I click that, it's going to center on that particular object, and it usually scales so that it's a comfortable size for working with that particular object, and I do use that a lot. There's a little cube up here that represents the different view facets. I can click, for instance, on front, and it's going to take me to that view. I can click and drag this cube to rotate it as well. Another thing I frequently use is when I really want precision, I want what's called an orthographic view, and it takes away perspective. I mean, right now you see lines of perspective going off into the distance, so it's very three-dimensional. I can make it a little more two-dimensional. So I'm going to click on the left-hand context menu here, switch to flat view is what I see when I hover over it. So I click that, and I get this kind of ugly more two-dimensional view, it becomes very useful if I click these view facets in the cube on the upper left. Right, because now I have far more precision in working with shapes, especially in relationship to the workspace grid. So in all but the very simplest designs, you're probably going to be using multiple shapes. So let's drag a cylinder onto our workspace. And in fact, you can use standard copy-paste kinds of keyboard shortcuts to very quickly make copies of this cylinder. So let's say I align it here and I'll resize it down to 10 millimeters across. I can then use Control-C on my keyboard, Control-V to make a copy of this cylinder. And let's say I want to make this cylinder 5 centimeters across. And then I'm going to click on the larger cylinder and I'm going to click the Fit View to Selected Shapes to zoom in. Now I'm in the orthographic view right now. If I switch to perspective view, you can see what's going on here very, very quickly. I'm going to go back to orthographic view because I do use it fairly frequently for close alignment. And I'm going to use these two shapes to demonstrate things you do with groups of shapes, which is a fundamental part of designing in TinkerCAD. So I'm going to click this shape, and let me go back to a view where I can see altitude, and I'm going to click and drag to move this up. And let's say I want this to be part of this. I can sort of move it in. You can see that it overlaps properly. So if I printed this out as a 3D printed design, this would all be one piece. Currently, TinkerCAD, though, is considering this to be two separate pieces. So I want to do two things. One, I want to align it. And then because I'm going to go on to work with other shapes and I want this to be treated as one piece for simplicity, and you'll find when you're designing in TinkerCAD that comes up frequently, I'll show you how to do that too. So let's go back to a top view orthographic. I want to align this precisely in the center of the larger cylinder. Okay, so I'm going to drag so that I grab both items. I could also hold down the Shift key and click one, then another. I have highlighted both items, and so TinkerCAD has made some features available to me. One is align. I'm going to hover over this icon with the two bars towards the upper right here. If I hover over it, it says align, gives me the keyboard shortcut L. I'll go ahead and click that, and I get these little alignment cues, which would allow me to align on the larger shape. So I'm going to go ahead and click this upper one to align this in one axis, and I'm going to click the side one here to align it in the other axis. Great. So now I'll just click anywhere on the workspace to release the alignment tool. Now if I click and drag my cube, I can see what I've done. That's exactly what I want to do. But I want this to be one piece. Okay, and again, you might do this at the end of having built a complicated design with all sorts of different parts, but you also might do this midway while you're building a design because you say, okay, this part is done. I do not want this to accidentally be altered while I'm working with other shapes. So I'm going to highlight both of these objects, and I'm going to come up here to this sort of square overlapping a circle. If I hover over it, it says group. Control G is the keyboard shortcut. I'll go ahead and click it though, and this becomes one shape. And what I will often do at that point is choose different colors for different sub-assemblies of my design. So let's just make this one gray. And so that is a crucial part. Now I can click and I can drag this whole object around. That's a crucial part of working with TinkerCAD for designs. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about, and this is crucial for TinkerCAD because for 3D designs, I use this most often. Every shape that you can grab here on the right-hand side, and in these drop-down menus, you have more shape options. I'm just working with the basic shapes here, okay? So be sure to explore these. You can make a sort of negative or void or empty space version of it. And this is how you carve out material or matter from your designs. So let's say I want to have this cylinder on top be hollow, and perhaps that hollow is going to extend down through the entire object I have here. So what I'm going to do, I can actually grab this hollow cylinder right here, this void cylinder right here. TinkerCAD automatically makes a square and a cylinder available just to make things a little quicker, since those are very commonly used shapes, both for solids as well as voids. In this case, I'm going to grab a cylinder just so I can demonstrate. I'll bring the cylinder here. Of course, it's way too big right now, so I'll resize it. Let's take it down, and it's kind of being hidden by this tool menu, but that's fine. I'll drag it where it can be seen, and let's take it down to, say, 3 millimeters across. Okay, and now I'm going to click the top drag handle for resizing, and let's make it nice and tall. Okay. Now, on this little tool menu, I have two choices. Either it could be solid or it could be void. I'm going to go ahead and click void. So now, when I click and I drag this into this other shape, it's going to represent a hollow. Okay? And in fact, I'm going to go back to the top view. I think I'm still in orthographic view. I am, so I can properly align this again. So I'm going to, let's just select all of them, and I'm going to choose the Align tool. And once again, I'll use the alignment guides to align the hollow cylinder in the center of the other two cylinders, which are a single shape. Okay. Now I'm going to maybe go back to the more three-dimensional view. In fact, let's go back to perspective view. Okay, I can see where it's hollowed this out, but if I want more definition, especially if this is going to be a subassembly and then I'm going to move on to creating another part, I'm going to select all three of those, and again, I'm going to use the group tool. And once I do that, you can see that TinkerCad has actually performed the hollow, so to speak. So now when I move around, I can see down through the object. I can even see up through the object. So creating these voids are crucial in TinkerCAD designs, because oftentimes, as often as you're creating shapes, you're carving out shapes using these voids. One last thing real quick, sort of a bonus. You can set up the settings for your workspace by clicking settings. I'm not going to go into that right now. I tend to default in millimeters. It's base 10. It's easy for doing designs. The snap grid is, when I'm moving an object around, it sort of snaps to the nearest millimeter as is represented on this grid. I can change that. So like I can click this and I can change it down to a 0.5 millimeter. And now I have more subtlety in moving my object. This is really good for aligning parts in different orientations into one another. I can even turn off the grid altogether. And that seems tempting, but you will often find that it's difficult to be precise if you do that. So what I always say is use the largest measurement you absolutely can to align things. Use the smallest measurement you need and no smaller.